Hello there, welcome back to the Chap's Guide. My name is Ash and I am your host on this journey through men's style, self-development and personal grooming. Now today is a video I've been meaning to do for some time because I have reviewed both of these watches independently to each other and individually, and I've been asked by several people in the comments of those videos if I would consider comparing them and giving a bit of a challenge comparison between these two pieces. And I think I've now owned these watches for long enough, I've worn them for long enough, I've lived with them quite sufficiently to allow me to give you my thoughts and views on both of these watches as a comparison. And of course, the two watches are the ROLEX GMT-Master 2 and the TUDOR Black Bay GMT. And what they both share is their coloration. They are both of the red and blue bezel variety, often referred to as the PEPSI bezel because of the likeness of those colours to the famous soft drink. So I'm going to compare these two Pepsis for you today, a Pepsi challenge, so to speak. And I think this watch type, this colour variation of these two watches is one of the most sought after watch bezel colour choices in the world, and I think for obvious reasons, because the red and the blue, they're primary colours, all right? They elicit certain responses in the people who look upon them, and typically people will often say they have red as a favourite colour or blue as a favourite colour, and that's why these colours are so sort of sought after and desired by people who go looking for interesting wristwatches. And they've been around for a while now. I think the PEPSI bezel variety of watch has been around since the 1950s, when one of these two watches sort of brought it into the modern consciousness. And since then, they've always been popular for gentlemen and women, of course. If you look at every single watch manufacturer, more or less, they will have or will have had a PEPSI bezel in their collection somewhere because they are so universally popular. The reason why I bought a PEPSI bezeled watch or blue-red bezeled watch is because I rather like those colours. They're not often seen in menswear. Certainly bright red is rarely seen. And I think when you look upon those colours, they're quite joyful, they're quite casual, they're immediately, obvious to the eye, and it brings me a lot of pleasure in wearing these two watches. So before I compare them and tell you what I think of each individually, I think what we'll do, we'll take a quick look, just a quick look at each of these two watches. I'll remind you about some of their characteristics and their statistics, and then I'll tell you my observations having lived with these two watches for quite some time. Okay, so here we have it, the TUDOR Black Bay GMT. Apologies for a reflection, but we are out in nature. And what we see here is a stainless steel case watch, which is 41 millimeters in diameter. And in this particular case, this watch is on a stainless steel oyster bracelet, so to speak, which is what I purchased it on, but the watch is also available on a leather strap and a NATO strap of very high quality too, but I would always recommend one buys a metal bracelet if you have the option. Now that stainless steel gives this watch quite a bit of weight. This overall package here, which is sized to my wrist, 6.5-inch wrist, weighs 174 grams. So it's quite a chunky old piece. And what are the distinguishing features for this? Well, the thing which draws the eye, the reason why we're here today, is that bezel, all right? So that bezel, the blue and the red, of course, for those who are unfamiliar, the blue indicates the night hours, the red, the daytime hours when using the GMT hand, which you can just see there below the date window. That is anodized aluminium, which is effectively paint onto an aluminium bezel, opposed to the very different type of bezel which we'll see in a moment on the Rolex. So that's what draws the eye. You can see it's quite a muted colour. It's not super bright red and very blue, so it is quite subtle, I would go as far as to say. It is a water resistant watch to 200 meters. So it's a very capable watch, as capable as many dive watches. It's got a screw down crown, and as you can see, it's a very large crown, signed with the Tudor rose. Large, easy to grip, easy to use. And when you pop that crown, we see that what we have here, easy to move, but also we have the hour marker moves around quickly and independently. This is the sign of a true GMT movement, making it very easy to operate on any sort of basis. That large crown, easy to grip, easy to make use of. Very, very comfortable watch to operate. A black dial with rhodium hands, as you can see, an hour, a minute and a second hand, but also you'll note that red hand with a snowflake on the end, the same as the hour hand and the second hand. That red hand is the GMT hand. The GMT complication allows us to track a second time zone at the same time as our primary time zone. And it does that because that red hand takes 24 hours to go around the dial. Now your normal hour hand goes around twice, of course, from midnight till noon and noon until midnight, a full circumference. That hand goes round once every 24 hours, so using the bezel markers, we're able to work out what the time is elsewhere in the world, allowing us to track 2 time zones at the same time. Now, 41 millimeters this watch, but that's not the true factor here in the size of this piece. What the factor is, which everybody always makes reference to, is the depth or the thickness of this watch, which is 14.6 millimeters, making this rather a chunky piece, it's fair to say. And as you can see, it's quite slab-sided. People often refer to it as slab-sided. It's quite a chunk when he's on the wrist, no doubt about that. And with that weight, it's a very noticeable unit. Now, it's 50 millimeters from one side to the other, the wingspan, as they often say. But these are irrelevant. It depends on the size of your wrist and how you like to wear your watch, ultimately, depending on whether you like that or not. Inside this watch is the Tudor in-house movement, the MT5652, which is COSC certified, so it's an officially certified chronometer piece, and it has a 70-hour power reserve, self-winding movement, which makes this a very practical and usable watch to wear. Now, as you can see, it's a combination of polish and satin finishes on the piece. The bracelet is satin finished, so I think it's quite a utilitarian piece, and it is a watch which is eminently wearable. It has something of a retro styling to it, and when you look at this watch, I often get put in mind of a bygone era. And that is one of the reasons why I have enjoyed wearing it over the last 2 years since I've owned it. So that is the Tudor Black Bay GMT. Okay, so the second watch we're going to look at has got that telltale red-blue bezel, and it is the Rolex GMT-Master 2. Reference number 126710 BLRO. And the BLRO stands for Bleu Rouge, which is French for blue and red. And it's obvious, isn't it? But this time you'll notice that the red on the bezel is a little bit more vivacious, a little bit more in your face, and the blue a little bit more blue. The reason for that? Well, twofold. They've chosen to go for those colours, but also, in this case, the bezel colours are represented to us in a ceramic material which is inlaid into the bezel, which gives us a material which Rolex says will never fade, and it's almost impossible to scratch, which is slightly different to that anodized aluminium, which is a little bit more vulnerable to fading and scratching. Now, the Rolex watch is different in its dimensions too. Let's talk about the obvious, the bracelet. On this particular occasion, the bracelet on this watch is the Rolex Jubilee bracelet. However, the watch is also available on the Oyster bracelet too, should you wish to go down that route. Slight difference in price. The Jubilee, I think, is about £200 more expensive because there's a bit more engineering involved in the articulation of the Jubilee. But personal preference, you can choose what you like. The case is a 40mm case. However, you think, oh, there's only a millimetre in it, is it worth mentioning? It is, because the thickness of this watch is only 12mm, opposed to that 14.6mm of the Tudor. And as you can see, slight difference here. where the crown is this time, we have crown guards on the Rolex, and the crown is somewhat smaller, again signed by the Rolex crown. With the trip lock, you see the 3 little dots on the crown there, which indicates this is a screw down crown watch, which has a water resistance to 100 meters. So 100 meters less capability than the Tudor, unusually. It's also a COSC certified watch, which means it's a certified chronometer watch, and inside beats the Rolex 3285 in-house movement inside the watch. Also, it's a GMT function watch, so again you can just see, hang on, I'll just pop the crown and move that minute hand, which is obscuring there we go, the red hand of the GMT movement. And exactly like the Tudor, this also has the jumping hour hand, which tells us it's a true GMT movement inside. As I say, 70 hours of power reserve, exactly the same as the Tudor. This time it's white gold hands, and you can see instead of having a snowflake, the Rolex has its telltale Mercedes hand, as it's called, for the hour hand. As well as the hands being of white gold, so are the indices. So the hour markers are white gold, also filled with luminescence, the same as the Tudor, slightly different luminescence. It's the Rolex version. On the bezel, you will see the hour markers. They appear to be white on first glance, but actually it is inlaid with platinum on the Rolex, which means that they are never going to fade. They shouldn't diminish as time goes by. Now again, it's a combination of polished and satin finish, but as I say, it's a slimmer watch. It sits very differently on the wrist. One would say a little bit more comfortable. One of the advantages to the Rolex is in its clasp, because the Rolex has the advantage of having the patented Easy Link, which means you can get, with a snap of your fingers, you get an extra 5 millimeters of size, which is easily altered if you want to change it. So if your wrist is swollen because of the hot temperature or whatever, you can swiftly change it, and you've got comfort at your fingertips without any tools required. So there we go. That is the Rolex GMT-Master 2. Now let's see what my thoughts and views are of those two pieces. Okay. All right then, so let's compare these two watches. Now you might say, is it fair to compare two watches which are actually very far apart in price? Because what I didn't mention in those quick catch-up reviews is the fact that the Tudor Black Bay GMT costs, I believe, £3,200 British pounds on the market today. The Rolex, by comparison, costs £8,600. So there's a big difference there. In fact, I think it's mathematically £5,400. So a lot of difference between these two watches. But I think it is a fair situation to compare them, because they both perform the same function. They both look very much the same. They both perform very much in a similar fashion. They are made of the same material, and they were even released at exactly the same time under the umbrella of the same watch family, the Rolex family. Of course, Tudor is a subsidiary brand of Rolex, and Rolex being the sort of mother company, so to speak. So I think it is fair to compare them, or at least for fun, give you my observations as way of a comparison. Okay, so let's start with the Tudor Black Bay GMT. It is a big, rugged and fun watch, that is for sure. For me, it elicits thoughts of a retro era. It looks like a generation ago of wristwatches. It's not all modern and trendy. It's not using ceramic in the bezel. This is doing it the old-fashioned way, and it comes across beautifully. I rather like the simple dial. I like the easy-to-read hands. The luminescence is superb. The GMT function is easy to operate. The big crown makes it easy to use if your hands are wet. It's a diving watch, to be honest. You know, the Black Bay GMT, sorry, the Black Bay range is basically diving watches, 200 meters of water resistance. And what they've done here is thrown a GMT movement into their dive watch, so you've got the best of both worlds. You've got a dive watch with a GMT complication. This watch feels like a utility tool. It is genuinely, it feels like a tool watch. It feels like a watch you could happily go trekking through the rainforest with. You could hammer nails in with. You could even use it like James Bond did in his novels when he used his Rolex as a knuckle duster. It's got that sort of weight. It's a heavy piece, 174 grams compared to the Rolex, which is 138 grams sized for my wrist. So it feels heavier. It is a big chunk of watch for sure. And there's no doubt, it's a gorgeous watch. It really looks the part. And as far as GMT watches go, on the market today, there are few which can hold a comparison to the looks of this watch. And I include the Rolex in that category. However, like all watches, there are flaws. And the flaws of the TUDOR GMT, unfortunately, are quite a big issue for many people. There were, of course, when the watch was initially released, concerns about the movement, because in the early days of this watch there were issues with the date window getting stuck between days, so you'd get half of one day and half of the other displayed in the window, and that did require people to send their watches away to be repaired. And that was a really widespread problem, and it did affect the credibility of the watch for a while. I have to say mine, I believe, is of the second generation, so it hasn't suffered with any issues, although there's always that doubt in the back of your mind, which you shouldn't really be having if you've spent over £3,000 on a watch. But that isn't the biggest problem of the TUDOR GMT. Its biggest issue, the criticism it always draws, is its size. It is a big old wristwatch, 14.6 millimeters in depth, obviously necessitated because of the movement inside, is a big watch. Now, I've got a 6.5-inch wrist on my left wrist, slightly over 6.5, but there or thereabouts. On my wrist, this is really bordering on the too big for me. And I bought this watch at a time when I never thought I'd actually own the Rolex GMT, and I wanted to scratch the PEPSI itch, as they say. And I thought, well, the only way I'm going to do it is by buying the TUDOR Black Bay GMT. And for a long time, I really struggled to come to terms with this watch. It is by far the biggest watch that I own. It feels big on the wrist. And on the bracelet, there's a problem with the bracelet too. The bracelet has no micro adjustment on the fly. Now, there are 3 micro adjustment holes on the bracelet, but that's not a great deal. And I did struggle for a long time, and I still do, to find the perfect fit for this watch. It's never really just right, I have to say. I swapped it onto a leather bracelet, and I wore it for a whole summer when I first got this watch. I wore it trekking, I wore it mountain biking, I wore it camping, I wear it in the woods. So I really put this watch through its paces. It performed fantastically, but its flaws is its size and the comfort factor when it comes to getting the perfect fit on the bracelet. Okay, let's put that TUDOR down and pick up the Rolex, its cousin. Now, this watch cuts an entirely different path through life, predominantly because of its size and the way it just delivers that GMT function to us. It has much more vibrant colours for a start. The blue and the red, they're much more obvious. And when they are delivered in that ceramic, we know that those colours are going to be long lasting, they're going to look like that forever. And it's a bit more blingy on the wrist, that's true. Now, this particular watch, being on the Jubilee bracelet, means that I can get a much better fit to my wrist, and I have no problem at all with the Easy Link on the clasp finding the ideal sizing for my wrist, which I've struggled to do with the TUDOR on its bracelet. The other thing with the Rolex, it passes my shirt cuff test as well. Now, the TUDOR at 14.6 millimeters is never easily going to pass under your cuff on a shirt, which limits its wearability for me with formal attire. I would not describe the TUDOR as a formal watch at all. The Rolex, on the other hand, it definitely can be pressed into service in all of the same situations as the TUDOR, but equally it's at home when you're wearing a suit or in more formal or semi-casual clothing, as well as your full casual. And you know, it has the same utility to a degree, but not quite as rugged and as tough in capability as the Tudor. Whilst the Rolex does feel quite solid, of course it's a 40mm case made of stainless steel, it's not any soft touch, but whilst it feels rugged, the Tudor feels like it's hewn from a block of stainless steel, and nothing in the world is going to give it any problems at all. The Rolex, in comparison, feels a bit more flimsy. Now, one thing we have to bear in mind is the availability of these two watches. Whilst they're from the same manufacturing house, so to speak, Rolex, your experience of buying one of these watches is going to be very different. If you walk into any Tudor authorized dealer, you will most likely find a GMT on display in the window. You'll likely find one on a bracelet, you'll probably find one on a leather strap, and you might find one on the NATO strap in the window. No problem, go in, buy it, walk out with it an hour later. The Rolex, on the other hand, is totally different, all right? Because the Rolex has got much more of a following, right? More people want the Rolex GMT than Rolex produce those watches, which means that there is quite a challenge to find them. You certainly will never find one in an authorized dealer. You'll likely have to join some supposed waiting list, and you may get a call for one a number of years later if you're lucky. It took me 3 years to buy this Rolex GMT-Master 2 from an authorized dealer from which I've purchased several Rolex watches. So it would be arguable to say I'm a regular customer. So difficult to find both of these watches. And the big difference as well, if you sell the Rolex, you'll be able to make money back. Because the Rolex, because it's in short supply, people will pay a second-hand premium for it. They will pay more than the watch retail price. The Tudor, on the other hand, you're going to make a loss because they can go into a shop and buy a brand new one. So your Tudor, you're going to lose money if you seek to sell it in the pre-owned world. So from that point of view, Rolex is the winner if you can find one. Okay, so what are my final observations on these two pieces? Well, first of all, I'll say one thing. It's hard to come to terms with the fact that at retail price, the Rolex is worth £5,500 more than the Tudor. When you look at them side by side, they're made of the same material, right? They're both made of stainless steel, predominantly. Yes, it's true to say there are some precious metals involved in the manufacture of the Rolex, but I don't think it's £5,500 worth. So yeah, it's hard to get over that premium which the Rolex affords than the Tudor. However, that said, what are their differences? Well, the Tudor is big and it's rugged, and if you are a man of large proportions, all right, if you've got a 7-inch wrist and above, and you're a big powerful fellow, and you want a big imposing watch on your wrist, which keeps track of a second time zone, which is classical and retro in its appearance, and it is rugged, it is tough, it is water resistant to 200 meters, and you don't care about wearing it in formal situations. You don't care that it doesn't slip under the cuff of your shirt. The Tudor represents fantastic value for money. The Rolex, on the other hand, feels a little bit more dainty, certainly compared to this Tudor. It feels like a small watch, even though its proportions are not small at all. It has more vibrant colours, so if you're interested in buying the watch for the colour reasons, the Rolex is going to give you a bit more back in that regard. Certainly, it slips under the cuff of your shirt more easily. And with the options of the bracelet being the Jubilee or the Oyster, and I have GMT-Master 2s with both of those options. I've got an Oyster bracelet version and this Jubilee version. It just allows you to make your watch look a bit differently. So, you know, the Jubilee is a little bit more stylish, a little bit more formal in appearance. There's a bit more polished material here, so it reflects the sunlight. It looks a bit more formal, there's that to say. And it wears more comfortably on my wrist, for sure. Your wrist may be totally different. Your experience might be you like big rugged watches. But for me, the watch I'm strapping on at the end of this comparison is going to be the Rolex GMT-Master 2, which for me represents the better watch for the characteristics which I want it for. I own both. I'm not going to sell either. In fact, I've pretty much come to the decision that I'm going to pass on the Tudor to my son, because he is a big lad and this watch fits him already. So I think he will get a great deal of joy from it. I'm not giving it to him now, but I will give it to him when he's old enough to appreciate it and take pleasure from it. And it'll be his first steps into the luxury watch world. But for me, the Tudor didn't scratch my PEPSI bezel itch. It took the Rolex to do that. I'm sure we'll all find a different conclusion depending on what your needs and wishes are. So there we are, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this video today comparing these two classic PEPSI bezel watches of the Tudor Black Bay GMT and the Rolex GMT Master 2. If you have enjoyed this video, I would encourage you to give us a thumbs up. It really makes a difference to me to know that you've enjoyed this content. Click the red button if you'd like to subscribe, and if you'd like to practically support the channel, of course you can do that by buying me a coffee. You'll find the link to the Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes below. Today's video came about because of comments I received from viewers who asked me to compare these two watches. So if you've got a comment for me, please leave it in the comment section below. I would love to hear them. So until the next time, wear your watches as ever with pride and passion. And I will see you again very soon.